All right, delighted to be joined by Johnny McKinstry, who is a Northern Irish football coach who has had quite the globe-trotting career and has now taken his career to Bangladesh, where he's the head coach of Saif Sporting Club in the capital Dhaka. Johnny, thanks a million for joining us all the way from Dhaka. How did this move come about?
Well, any moves in football, it's not normally the traditional way of sort of you see in a job opening and you apply for it. It was very much, again, someone I knew within the game who had previously been head coach of a club in East Africa where some of my Rwandan players were playing, and he was out here in Bangladesh and actually is the person I've taken over from at this club. And I think he had an opportunity to go on to maybe what we considered a stronger league than Bangladesh, or one that he considered better for his career, but his relationship with the club was such that they asked him before he departed if he could introduce them to one or two candidates who could maybe take the club on and try to continue on that sort of forward path to try and get them to that sort of top position in the league. And really it was one or two phone calls, and within sort of 48 hours, 72 hours from first finding out about the opportunity to sort of stepping on an airplane out here to South Asia. So it was all very quick, but again, it's sort of introductions and people you've met along the way. It's about putting people together and saying they think you'd be a good fit for something. And so far I've been here a couple of weeks and it seems to be quite a good fit so far.
Yeah, and Bangladesh wouldn't be known as a footballing power at all. Like we'd know it more for cricket, like its neighbour India and Pakistan, which obviously would have had historical ties. So in terms of the standard when you've got there, what did you find? Or were you maybe surprised that it was of a higher standard than maybe what you may have expected?
Yeah, I'd done a little bit of research, and obviously the national team coach here is English as well, and so I was able to reach out to him and speak to him about his national team players. And the consensus I got was that the standard of the league was probably about National League level in England, so conference level, and that's sort of borne out to be quite true. But then you have the added facet of each team here in this league, as with many Asian leagues, are allowed 4 foreign players. There's a quota of foreign players, and a bit like Major League Soccer in America, those foreign players tend to be like marquee signings that you can pay a significant amount of money to. And so we have 4 players. We've got a Russian player, we've got a couple of Colombians, we have a South Korean, and it's the same. There's a number of African players in the league, and they probably add a different dynamic to it. So in general, the standard's about National League level, but then you have players who would maybe be sort of League One Championship level who are then supplementing the team. So it's interesting, and it's an interesting dynamic when you have those players coming from outside in who, yes, they are maybe earning a good amount of money to be here, but then a lot more is expected of them. And I think the league as a whole is trying to follow on in some way of what the Indian sort of Super League is doing, in terms of they obviously put a lot of investment in. You're starting to see more investment come into the Bangladesh game.
Yeah, and obviously your career, or where you are now, it's very far from Lisburn. So, how did you actually get onto this coaching ladder, even from the first place when you were back home?
I think for me, I was probably reasonably self-aware as sort of a teenager, and when I was growing up in Lisburn, and I loved football, but I sort of knew that whilst I would consider myself a competent, reasonable standard footballer, I knew that growing up in Northern Ireland, where it's a semi-professional league and the standard's not all that high domestically, it was, if you wanted to play football, you had to be good enough to make the step over to England or Scotland. And I sort of knew by the age of sort of 16, 17 that I wasn't likely to get that opportunity, but I felt I understood the game. And so started doing little bits of coaching on the side whilst I was still studying. And that really, one thing led to another. When you get good feedback about a thing, when you see yourself doing well at it, you naturally take it on and go to the next level in it. And, for me, it was very much that. It was that I saw success, I saw progress, from an early stage in coaching, and sort of stuck with it and sort of took just different opportunities along the way. And, it sounds very matter of fact, I know, but the way I sort of look at it, it was very much that. It was at each stage, what's the next opportunity? What's the next step? What's the next qualification? And sort of adding those experiences and, that understanding of the game sort of has allowed me to progress.
Yeah, and like you went to Newcastle United, then New York Red Bulls, and then you ended up at the Right to Dream Academy in Ghana. So we actually had the founder on, Tom Vernon, about 4 years ago when we were doing our first World Cup shows, and we kind of got his perspective on African football just for that World Cup tournament. But in terms of when you get there first, is there an element of culture shock, even from the non-footballing side?
Yeah, there is. It's funny you ask that. I was saying to my assistant coach here, who's sort of been with me now in Rwanda, Lithuania, and now here in Bangladesh. And I was saying this is probably his first experience, Bangladesh, of what I would term a really sort of developing culture. And Bangladesh reminds me a lot of Sierra Leone in terms of its standard of development. And I said to him, I was like, it's his first real experience of that, because Rwanda's more developed, Lithuania naturally is. And my first experience of Ghana all those years ago, if I could bottle up one sort of sensation to sort of let other people experience, it would be that sort of first car journey in Ghana after having touched down at sort of in Accra and then driven up to the Right to Dream Academy, which at the time was a much smaller operation than it is now. You know, it was in the hills of Ghana in their old academy site, which was an old sort of first division football ground, but just the noises and the sounds and the heat and the smells and everything, you know, for me in my early 20s at the time was just something that I'd never experienced. And it is a culture shock, and it's a shock to the senses, but equally, you know, over the you know, preceding sort of 10, 12 years since that point, every time, you know, whether it's been with my academies or with the national teams, when I've brought people out to Africa, maybe for the first time, I always think to myself, oh, you're experiencing that, you know, and that was a great experience. That culture shock was just a great thing for me. But it's ultimately what sort of drew me to keep coming back to Africa and also now Asia. And it's what doesn't scare me off about coming to the developing world, because it's so rich in terms of experience. And
did it change your perspective of the way European clubs recruit from Africa? Because maybe we always have a perspective here, but maybe you've actually seen how it actually works from that side of the fence.
Yeah, I think when European clubs come looking for an African player, they're looking for a physically dominant, sort of fast player. Those are the attributes I think a lot of European clubs look for in an African player. They're looking for Yaya Toure. They're looking for, you know, a Solomon Kalou, you know, one of those two type of players. And there's a lot more types of players in Africa. You know, there's plenty of JJ Okochas, but that's not necessarily what European clubs are looking for from Africa. I do also think that maybe, you know, a lot of them up until recently have probably just went purely on, yes, he's a talented footballer, let's bring him in. And you obviously mentioned the Right to Dream Academy, and one of their big things that they promote so well is sort of character development of the young players. And this is a big thing I find, recruiting in general, but especially when you're recruiting from, you know, a developing nation, is, you know, the character of players. Because if you bring a player out of, you know, Ghana or Sierra Leone or Ivory Coast, wherever it happens to be, and bring him to France or Spain or England, you talked about sort of culture shock for maybe me coming to the developing world, but for a player like that, you know, I still remember when I first brought some of my boys from Sierra Leone. They came and trained with Liverpool one summer in their academy, and they were all sort of 15. There was 4 of them. They were 15, and I accompanied them on the trip. And we landed at Heathrow Airport, and we got on an escalator, and it was the first time these boys had ever been on an escalator. And, you know, I literally sort of had to grab one of them by the sort of the jumper to stop him from sort of falling backwards, because that's sort of, you know, thing where you're uncertain of something, you edge away from it. And again, you forget about these things, that here's these kids, you know, teenagers, young men who've seen all of this stuff on the TV and on the movies because they watch them all the time, but they've never experienced it. And so you bring them into this sort of advanced, sort of technologically advanced culture that is Europe or is America, and you've got to support that process. And I think clubs are starting to get better at that, but I think for a lot of time you probably lost a lot of talent from the developing world because they came and they struggled, and if you're not a success straight away, then because clubs are under pressure to win football matches, they don't have time to be patient. So I think they're getting a lot better at that these days, though.
Yeah, and you mentioned Sierra Leone. You took them to 50th in the FIFA rankings, which is an all-time high for them, and also 7th in Africa, which, when you consider the strength of some of the African national teams, it's a huge achievement. So what did you implement there? Because obviously it's national team level, so you only have players for a certain period of time.
Yeah, I think, for me, we went in there and we were just very clear on what our objectives were. And, I know that was, I only know it from my side of the picture. I'd love to have been able to see it through the eyes of some of the players, because obviously I was a young head coach at the time. I was only 27. The majority of my team were older, and I suppose they probably had their doubts coming in, but we went in and, I had experience of building sort of football structures and sort of building curriculums, and I went in very matter of fact and said, look, this is where we want to go, this is where we want to take it, and this is how we're going to do it. And we had answers to the various questions players put to us, and I think they then saw the quality that we were supplying them with, and that we were adopting, a very much sort of European training model with them. And because with Sierra Leone, the majority of the players were coming down from clubs in Europe, our national team was almost exclusively based in Europe and the United States. We weren't calling up players from the domestic league because there was so much talent from Sierra Leone out there. So I think they appreciated that they were flying down to West Africa, but yet they were receiving the same sort of level of quality and the same type of program that they were receiving in their European club environment. And really, with Sierra Leone, I think a big part of it was making sure that the football structures and the coaching staff didn't get in the way of the players, because there was enough talent there. It was sort of like, look, let's not hinder this talent by allowing logistical challenges or allowing hotel arrangements and all of this. Let's not let that get in the way of their talent. And we worked very hard in Sierra Leone to make sure all of those things were taken care of. And in Europe, it's second nature, but sometimes in Africa and the developing world in general, those things can trip up national teams when they don't need to.
Yeah, and you had to face the challenge of Ebola, of course, as well, which there was an outbreak around the time you were there. You chose to actually stay in the country and to try and help out from that side as well. From the footballing side, maybe before we get to the human side, obviously you lose home advantage in terms of being able to host games in Freetown, and it's generally around the world you're talking about like a 65% home advantage, but in Africa then that's actually 80% given the travel distances, logistics and elsewhere. So how did you cope with that, you and the team? It
was very difficult, there's no doubt about that. Not only did we give up home advantage, we were in a qualifying group that contained the Ivory Coast, Cameroon and DR Congo. And obviously at the end of the African Cup of Nations, Ivory Coast ended up winning the tournament and DR Congo finished third. So we were in what would be termed the group of death footballing terms, and then we obviously had to give up home advantage. So it was a great challenge. But for the players, we sort of said to them, look, it's a difficult time for Sierra Leone. Obviously everyone has family back in Sierra Leone, but in some small way, can we as a national team be almost a beacon of light? Is what we said, is look, everyone in the country's crazy about football. You know how passionate they are. They would love to be at the stadium watching you. They can't be, but you can be sure they're watching on the TV. And if we can go out there and put on a performance and even maybe get a result against these giants of African football, well then that might just lift the mood in the nation, even if it's only for a day. If we could take people's minds off, the tragedy that was happening in Sierra Leone at that time, even for a couple of hours, then it's worth it. And so we sort of said to the players, look, we can do that. We can lift the mood. We can lift the spirit of the nation, even in a small way. But also we can portray a positive image of Sierra Leone to the world, because at the time, obviously all the news stories on the BBC, on CNN, it was all about this really negative thing that was happening. And if we could, even if it's just in the sports column, put a positive, story out there about Sierra Leone, then again, it's right. It doesn't all have to be negative in the global media. And so those were the two things we spoke to the players about, and they really got behind that message. And you know what? the results didn't come, but the performances were there, and we went out and we pushed Ivory Coast all the way to the wire. It took a late Gervinho goal to beat us in that game. DR Congo again, it was in the last 10 minutes we succumbed to them. So we went and put performances on that I know the people in Sierra Leone would have been proud of.
Yeah, from the human side, actually, interesting, just as the end of that Ebola outbreak came, I happened to be in Guinea, which is just beside Sierra Leone, and at that time it was just coming towards an end, and maybe the impression, like obviously in the global media, there was a sense of panic. I just noticed maybe among the population in Guinea, it wasn't quite, I know, look, there was an outbreak there, they were aware of it, but it seemed a little bit more blasé, and I wonder what the mood was like in Sierra Leone during the, I suppose, the worst of it.
Yeah, like, it's one of those things that the seriousness of the situation was very clear, and that's never more apparent to you than when you see, people in full white hazmat suits, walking up the street because they have to go and address a situation of someone who's either died of the disease or whatever it happens to be. And, when you see that, you're very clear of the seriousness of the environment you find yourselves in. But equally, the Ebola disease is one of contact. And so it's one of those things, it's not an airborne disease. So anything that is contact based is something that you can, if you're careful, in some ways control. And so the thing was, in Sierra Leone, it was, there was chlorine hand washes outside every place of business, every restaurant. A lot of things, obviously, it was more of a curfew situation as well, sort of involved that they asked people not to be out and about in the evenings and all. And, in social gatherings were sort of, not formally restricted, but very much advised against. And so people knew, by and large, how they could keep themselves reasonably safe. Now, as you say, you can never be 100% on anything, but I do think the general populace, they knew what was required to keep themselves safe. The other side of it as well is, Sierra Leone as a country has been through so much, and so I think the people of Sierra Leone have maybe learned to, just keep going, just keep and get through the other side of it, with the Civil War and all those things. And so, yeah, it was that sort of, almost like a very old sort of British sort of characteristic of we're just going to keep going. And yeah, they ultimately got through it. Yeah,
and I suppose the final question before I let you go. So obviously you went to Rwanda, then managed their national team for a while, and then also was in charge of a club in Lithuania, Kauno Žalgiris. But in terms of where you're going to take your career next, when you finished up in Bangladesh, are you planning to continue, coaching outside of Europe, or do you have actually ambitions to come back and coach either, whether it's in England, Ireland, Scotland, or somewhere on the European continent?
Yeah, to me, I'm very open. Like, naturally, on a personal level, you would like to be closer to family. That's natural. My family are in Ireland and in England, and so you want to be as close to them as possible. But equally, football isn't an industry where you get to choose quite so easily. It's a highly competitive industry. Even if you take England, for example, there's only 92 first-team manager stroke head coaches jobs in the Football League, and there's hundreds upon hundreds of people wanting them. So it's a highly competitive market. The other side of it as well is, I think in the UK, sometimes because we have the Premier League and that's all engrossing, we miss what's going on in the rest of the world. And I think it's very easy for people to sort of go, the Chinese Super League's not a good league, or the Indian Super League's, only so good. But actually, when you come out to these places, the passion for football is huge. Earlier today, it was the Federation Cup final here, so they play the cup competition a little bit differently, where instead of it being interspersed between the league games, they play it as one standalone tournament. We would have had sort of 14,000, 15,000 people at the game, and a good atmosphere and everything, and people here love football. They really are crazy about their football. And And so that's the same in other Asian nations. I know, for example, a friend of mine used to work in Cambodia until recently, and when their national team plays, they're getting 60, 70,000 in every home game. So, these are football crazy nations, and yes, they're at different stages in their development, but whilst it would be nice to come back and be closer to family, on a professional level, working in England isn't the be all and end all. There's a lot of good opportunities around the world, and it's really just about that. It's about assessing the individual opportunity. I didn't think my career in Bangladesh, but this football club I've joined, very ambitious, and they want to be one of the top 10 clubs in not just Bangladesh but in Asia, and that's where they want to go, and they're willing to finance that, and they're willing to support the process. So this club was the right club to come to, and it just happens to be in Bangladesh.
Yeah, well, best of luck with your time in Bangladesh, and also it's well in advance of Christmas, but also at a very, very early Merry Christmas to you as well, and Happy New Year, and maybe someday again, obviously we'll chat again wherever you're taking your career.
No problem, Ralph. Thank you very much.